Officer James Miller drove his police car slowly down Main Street. It was a quiet Sunday in the small town of Riverdale. The summer sun was shining, and most people were enjoying a peaceful afternoon. But then his radio crackled to life. "Officer Miller, we have a noise complaint at the old church on Main Street. Caller reports shouting and a possible fight at a wedding reception. Please check it out." James sighed and turned on his flashing lights. In his 15 years as a police officer in this town, he had seen many family fights at weddings. People got emotional, drank too much, and old family problems came up. He was not looking forward to this call. As he pulled up to the white church with its tall bell tower, he could already hear the angry voices from outside. A few guests in fancy clothes stood nervously in the parking lot, looking uncomfortable. "Is everything okay?" James asked one of the men in a blue suit. "The bride's parents are causing a scene," the man said quietly. "They're yelling at everyone, especially the wedding planner. It's really ruining the day." James nodded and walked into the church hall. The place was beautifully decorated with flowers and white ribbons. A small band was setting up in the corner, but they had stopped playing. All eyes were on the angry couple in the middle of the room. The woman wore an expensive blue dress that looked like it cost more than James made in a month. Her face was red with anger as she pointed at the flower arrangements on the tables. The man beside her, tall with gray hair and wearing a fancy gray suit, was filming everything on his phone and making threats. "This is completely unacceptable," the woman shouted at a young woman who must be the wedding planner. "We paid thousands of dollars for this wedding, and you bring us these cheap flowers. Where are the imported roses I ordered?" The wedding planner, whose name tag read Sarah, looked close to tears. "Ma'am, these are exactly the flowers that were in the contract. I have the signed papers right here." "Don't tell me what I signed." The woman cut her off. "I know what I wanted for my daughter's wedding." James stepped forward, adjusting his uniform. "Excuse me, folks. I'm Officer Miller from Riverdale Police. We received a noise complaint. What seems to be the problem here?" The angry couple turned to him, both starting to talk at once. James held up his hand. "One at a time, please," he said calmly, taking out his small notebook. "Ma'am, would you like to start?" The woman took a deep breath, trying to look calm but still clearly angry. "My name is Elizabeth Conway, and this is my husband, Robert. We paid a fortune for our only daughter's wedding day, and everything is wrong. The flowers are cheap local weeds instead of the imported roses we ordered. The cake hasn't arrived yet. The music is all wrong. This wedding planner has ruined everything." James wrote down the details and turned to the wedding planner. "And your side of the story, miss?" Sarah wiped a tear from her eye. "Officer, I have all the signed contracts right here," she said, pulling out a folder from her bag. Every single detail was approved by Melissa and David, the bride and groom. "I've done exactly what they asked for." Robert Conway stepped forward. "That's impossible. We planned this entire wedding. Our daughter was too busy with medical school to handle the details." Something didn't feel right to James. After 15 years on the police force, he had developed a good sense for when people weren't telling the whole truth. "May I see those contracts?" he asked Sarah. As he looked through the papers, he noticed something strange. All the contracts were indeed signed by Melissa Conway and David Wilson. None had been signed by the parents. "Where are the bride and groom right now?" James asked, looking around the hall. Elizabeth hesitated. "They're taking photos by the lake behind the church, but there's no need to bother them with this. We can handle it." James noticed how quickly she wanted to keep him away from the couple. His police instincts were now fully alert. Something strange was happening here, and he was determined to find out what it was. Officer James Miller decided he needed to speak with the bride and groom. Something about this situation didn't make sense. The parents said they had planned everything, but the wedding planner had contracts signed only by the young couple. "I think I should talk to Melissa and David," he said firmly. "Please take me to them." Elizabeth Conway looked nervous. But officer, they're having their special moment. The photographer is taking their pictures by the lake. This won't take long, James insisted. I just need to clear up a few things. Robert Conway frowned but finally nodded. Fine. Follow us. The Conways led Officer Miller through a back door of the church. They walked down a small path that led to a beautiful lake. The water sparkled in the sunlight. Under a tree covered with small white flowers stood the bride and groom, posing for pictures. James was struck by how different the bride looked from her mother. Melissa Conway wore a simple white dress that flowed gently in the breeze. It had no fancy beads or lace. Her hair was down with just a few flowers in it. Next to her, David wore a light blue suit instead of a black one. They both looked happy and relaxed, until they saw Melissa's parents walking toward them with a police officer. The smile dropped from Melissa's face. Mom, Dad, what's going on? James stepped forward. Hello, I'm Officer Miller. Sorry to interrupt your special day. There seems to be some confusion about the wedding plans, and I'm trying to sort it out. David put his arm around his new wife. What kind of confusion? Your parents are upset about the flowers, the cake, and the music, James explained. They say these things are not what was planned. Melissa and David looked at each other, and James saw something pass between them, a look that told him they weren't surprised. Melissa took a deep breath. Officer Miller, my parents and I have very different ideas about what my wedding should be like. They wanted a huge, fancy event with hundreds of guests, expensive flowers, and a giant cake. But that's not what David and I wanted. We wanted something small and meaningful, David added. We tried to tell them, but they wouldn't listen. Elizabeth stepped forward. Honey, we just wanted the best for you. You deserve a perfect wedding. But it wasn't about what I wanted, was it, Mom? Melissa said quietly. It was about showing off to your rich friends. Robert's face turned red. We were trying to give you the kind of wedding a doctor's daughter should have. James watched as the real story began to unfold. So what happened with the planning? He asked. Melissa looked down at her simple dress. After months of fighting, David and I decided to plan our own wedding, exactly how we wanted it. We signed all the contracts ourselves and paid with our own money. But we didn't tell my parents all the details, she continued. We knew they would try to change everything. We just told them when and where to show up. You went behind our backs. Elizabeth gasped. We had to, David said firmly. You weren't listening to what Melissa wanted. James was beginning to understand. This wasn't just about wedding flowers or cake. It was about control. The parents couldn't accept that their daughter had grown up and made her own choices. So all of this, James said, gesturing around at the simple but beautiful setting, was exactly what you two planned. Yes, Melissa nodded. The local wildflowers instead of expensive imports. The homemade cake from David's aunt's bakery instead of some fancy 7-layer thing. The small local band instead of the expensive orchestra Mom wanted. James turned to the parents. Mr. and Mrs. Conway, it seems your daughter and her husband planned exactly the wedding they wanted. And from what I can see, it's lovely. Elizabeth was crying now, but they weren't sad tears. They were angry tears. Do you know what people will think? That we couldn't afford a proper wedding for our only daughter. And in that moment, James understood everything. Officer James Miller looked at Elizabeth Conway with new understanding. Her words made everything clear. This wasn't about her daughter's happiness at all. It was about showing off to others. So this is about what people will think of you, James asked quietly. Robert put his arm around his crying wife. You don't understand. We have a certain position in this town. People expect things from us. Melissa stepped away from her new husband and moved closer to her parents. Mom, Dad, I don't care what people think. This is my wedding day. Mine and David's, not yours. But we paid for, Robert began. You didn't pay for anything, David cut in. We used our own savings. We didn't want your money because it always comes with strings attached." James watched as the photographer quietly backed away, giving the family some privacy. Other wedding guests were starting to notice the problem and were watching from a distance. "Melissa," Elizabeth said, trying to calm down, "we just wanted to give you the best. You're going to be a doctor soon. You need to start building the right image." "The right image?" Melissa shook her head sadly. "Mom, I'm becoming a doctor to help people, not to impress them. That's something you never understood." James decided it was time to help this family find a way forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Conway, let me ask you something. When you look at your daughter right now, what do you see?" The parents looked confused by the question. "I see my little girl," Elizabeth said finally. "The one who always wanted to make us proud." "And she has," James said gently. "She's in medical school. She's found someone who loves her. And today she's getting married. But not the way we wanted," Robert insisted. "Maybe that's the problem," James suggested. "She's not your little girl anymore. She's a grown woman making her own choices." A small crowd of guests had gathered at a safe distance, watching the drama unfold. James noticed an older woman with kind eyes step forward. She looked a lot like Melissa. "Elizabeth," Robert, the older woman said, "I'm David's mother, Linda. Can I say something?" Elizabeth nodded stiffly. "When my son told me he was planning a simple wedding, I was a bit disappointed too," Linda admitted. "I had dreams of a big church wedding with all the trimmings. But then I realized something important. This day isn't about me or my dreams. It's about David and Melissa, and the life they want to build together." Linda took Elizabeth's hand in hers. "Our children aren't extensions of us. They're their own people, and our job as parents is to let them fly, even when they choose a different path than we would." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes again, but these seemed different. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time that day. "Your dress is beautiful," she said softly. Is it comfortable?" Melissa's face brightened with surprise. "Yes, Mom. That's why I chose it. I wanted to be able to move and dance and enjoy my day without feeling trapped in some heavy gown." A small smile appeared on Elizabeth's face. "You look happy." "I am happy, Mom," Melissa said, "or at least I was until all this started." James watched as something shifted in Elizabeth's expression. The anger was fading, replaced by something softer. She turned to the wedding planner who had followed them outside. "Sarah, isn't it?" Elizabeth asked. "I owe you an apology. I was awful to you, and you were just doing your job, giving my daughter the wedding she actually wanted." Sarah looked surprised but nodded. "It's okay, Mrs. Conway. Wedding days are emotional." Robert still looked unhappy, but he wasn't fighting anymore. He looked at his watch. "Well, if this is the wedding you wanted, I suppose we should try to enjoy it. What happens next on your schedule?" It was a small step, but James could see it meant everything to Melissa. The young bride hugged her father, careful not to wrinkle her simple dress. "Next," she said with a smile, "we all go inside and have some of Aunt Patty's amazing cake." Everyone walked back to the church hall together. Officer James Miller stayed close, making sure the peace would last. Inside, the small band had started playing soft music again. Guests were finding their seats at tables decorated with jars of wildflowers. "The flowers really are lovely," Elizabeth said, trying to see things with new eyes. "They look fresh. They were picked this morning from local farms," Sarah, the wedding planner, explained. Melissa wanted everything to be from nearby, to support local businesses. Robert was still quiet, but he wasn't complaining anymore. He looked around the room, noticing details he had missed before. The name cards at each place were handwritten. The chairs had simple white ribbons instead of fancy covers. Everything was modest, but made with care. "Was all of this your idea?" he asked his daughter. Melissa nodded. "David and I planned everything together. We wanted our wedding to reflect who we really are, not who anyone else thinks we should be." Just then, a woman in a flower-spotted apron hurried in through the side door. She carried a medium-sized cake on a wooden stand. It wasn't tall or covered in fancy decorations. Instead, it had 3 layers with fresh berries and cream between them, and a few flowers on top that matched the ones in the room. "Sorry I'm late," the woman called out. The berries needed more time to set. "That's the cake." Elizabeth couldn't help asking, her voice showing her surprise. "That's Aunt Patty," David explained. "My father's sister. She owns the best bakery in the next town over. She made our cake as her wedding gift to us." Aunt Patty set the cake down on the table and hugged David and Melissa. "It's my special recipe. The one you two always loved when you visited the bakery." James watched as Elizabeth looked at the cake. He could tell she was comparing it in her mind to the fancy wedding cake she had wanted. This one was smaller and simpler, but made with love by someone who knew the couple well. "Would you like to try a piece before everyone else?" Aunt Patty asked Elizabeth and Robert, holding out a small plate with 2 forks. "I brought some extra just in case." It was a peace offering. James saw Robert hesitate, then take the plate. He tried a small bite of the cake. "This is actually very good," he admitted, sounding surprised. "It's amazing," Elizabeth agreed after taking her own bite. "I've never tasted a cake like this before." Aunt Patty beamed. "Family recipe. Been in our family for generations." As they talked about the cake, James noticed something important happening. The Conways were starting to see that different didn't mean worse. The wedding their daughter had planned wasn't what they would have chosen, but it had its own kind of beauty. The band started playing a livelier song, and some guests began dancing. James watched as David led Melissa to the middle of the floor for their first dance as husband and wife. They moved well together, laughing when David almost stepped on Melissa's dress. "They look happy," James said to Elizabeth, who was standing nearby. "Yes," she admitted, "they do." "Isn't that what matters most?" he asked gently. Elizabeth didn't answer right away. She watched her daughter dancing, her face glowing with happiness. "I always thought I knew what was best for her," she said finally. "I never stopped to ask what she wanted." Robert joined them, 2 glasses of champagne in his hands. He gave one to his wife. "Maybe we should try to enjoy ourselves," he suggested. "After all, our daughter only gets married once, hopefully." Elizabeth took the glass. "You're right." Just then, the music changed. The band leader spoke into the microphone. "And now, it's time for the father-daughter dance." Robert froze, the champagne halfway to his lips. He hadn't prepared for this. After all the fighting, would Melissa even want to dance with him? James watched as Melissa walked over to her father. She held out her hand. "Dad, may I have this dance?" she asked quietly. Robert's eyes filled with tears. He handed his champagne to Elizabeth and took his daughter's hand. "It would be my honor," he said. The band played a slow, sweet song as Robert led his daughter to the middle of the dance floor. Everyone watched as the father and daughter began to dance. Robert was stiff at first, still feeling awkward after all that had happened. But as they moved, he began to relax. "I'm sorry, Dad," Melissa said softly. "I know this isn't the wedding you wanted for me." Robert shook his head. "No, I'm the one who should be sorry. Your mother and I. We got so caught up in what we thought was best that we forgot to listen to you." As they danced, Officer James Miller stood near the door. He had planned to leave, feeling the situation was under control, but something made him stay a little longer. He wanted to see how this family story would end. Elizabeth came to stand beside him, watching her husband and daughter dance. "Thank you," she said quietly. "If you hadn't come today, I think we would have ruined everything." "I didn't do much," James said. "You found your way on your own." "Not really," Elizabeth admitted. "Sometimes we need someone from outside to help us see what's right in front of us." She looked around the room. "This isn't what I pictured for Melissa's wedding, but now I can see it's perfect for her." As the song ended, David walked over to join Melissa and Robert. "May I cut in?" Robert hesitated for just a moment, then smiled and stepped back. "Take good care of her," he said, placing Melissa's hand in David's. "I promise," David replied. James watched as the young couple began to dance. The other guests joined them on the floor, including Robert, who went to find Elizabeth. Soon the whole room was filled with dancing and laughter. Sarah, the wedding planner, appeared at James's side, looking much happier than when he first arrived. "Crisis solved?" she asked. "I think so," James nodded. "Families are complicated." "You'd be surprised how often this happens," Sarah said. "Parents forget that weddings aren't about them. They're about the couple starting a new life together." As they talked, an older man approached them. He had the same kind eyes as David. "Officer," he said, holding out his hand. "I'm Thomas Wilson, David's father. I want to thank you for what you did today." James shook his hand. "Just doing my job, sir." Thomas smiled. "No, you did much more than that. You helped save my son's wedding day. And you might have helped heal a family." James looked across the room where Robert and Elizabeth were now chatting with Aunt Patty, laughing as she told them stories about David as a child. "Who are they, really?" James asked quietly. "The Conways, I mean. They seemed so focused on appearances." Thomas's face grew serious. Robert came from nothing. He worked his way up from a poor family to become a successful businessman. Elizabeth, too. She grew up with very little. I think when you come from nothing, sometimes you try too hard to be something. They wanted Melissa to have everything they didn't. James nodded with new understanding. The Conways weren't just rich, stuck-up people. They were people who had fought hard for everything they had and were afraid of going back to having nothing. They weren't trying to control their daughter. They were trying to protect her the only way they knew how. "I think they're learning that Melissa needs to find her own way," James said. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "And maybe today is the first step." As the music played and the guests danced, James decided it was time for him to leave. His job here was done. He slipped out quietly, not wanting to interrupt the celebrations. As Officer James Miller walked to his police car, he smiled to himself. It wasn't often that a call ended this well. Usually, when he responded to family fights, people stayed angry. But today, something special had happened. A family had started to heal. He was about to get into his car when he heard someone calling his name. He turned to see Melissa running toward him, still in her simple white dress, with David following behind her. "Officer Miller." "Wait," she called. "Please don't go yet." James waited as the young couple reached him. "Is everything okay?" he asked, worried that maybe the peace hadn't lasted. "Everything is perfect," Melissa said, slightly out of breath. "That's why we wanted to catch you. We couldn't let you leave without a proper thank you." David nodded. "You saved our wedding day. If you hadn't helped my parents understand." "We want you to stay," Melissa said. "Please join us for the rest of the celebration. You're our guest of honor now." James was surprised. In 15 years as a police officer, no one had ever invited him to stay at a wedding after answering a call. People usually wanted the police to leave as quickly as possible. "That's very kind," he said, "but I don't want to intrude on your special day." "You wouldn't be intruding," David insisted. "Without you, there might not be a special day to celebrate. Please." Inside the church hall, the party was in full swing. The band was playing happy music, and people were dancing and laughing. Even Robert and Elizabeth Conway seemed to be enjoying themselves now, talking with David's parents like old friends. When Melissa and David walked back in with Officer Miller, Robert raised his eyebrows in surprise. He walked over to them. "Officer Miller, I thought you had left," he said. "We invited him to stay," Melissa explained. "He's our guest now." Robert looked uncomfortable for a moment, then straightened his shoulders. "Officer, I owe you an apology. When you first arrived, I was rude and difficult. I was so focused on what I thought this wedding should be that I couldn't see what it actually was. A beautiful day for my daughter." He held out his hand. "Thank you for helping me see that before it was too late." James shook Robert's hand, feeling the strong grip of a man who had worked hard all his life. "No apology needed, Mr. Conway. I'm just glad everything worked out." Elizabeth joined them, carrying 2 plates of cake. She handed one to James. "You must try this amazing cake. David's aunt is a genius." As the night went on, Officer James Miller learned more about Melissa and David's story. They had met 3 years ago when Melissa was volunteering at a free clinic where David worked as a nurse. They shared the same values: helping others, living simply, and choosing happiness over fancy things. "So you're going to be a doctor, and David is a nurse?" James asked Melissa as they talked at one of the tables. "That's how you met?" Melissa nodded. "Yes. I was helping at the clinic to get experience before medical school. David showed me around on my first day. I thought she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen," David added with a smile. "And the kindest." Elizabeth, who was sitting nearby, looked down at her hands. "We didn't know David was a nurse until today," she admitted quietly. "Melissa only told us she was dating someone from the clinic. We assumed he was a doctor." "Would that have mattered to you?" James asked carefully. Robert sighed. "I'm ashamed to say it, but probably yes. At least back then. We were so focused on status and appearances." He looked at David. "I'm sorry. We judged you before we even knew you." David shook his head. "It's okay. I understand. You just wanted the best for your daughter." "But we were wrong about what the best means," Elizabeth said. "The best isn't the most expensive or the most impressive. The best is what makes Melissa happy. And clearly, you make her very happy." Later, as people started to leave, James found himself talking with an older woman who turned out to be Melissa's grandmother, Elizabeth's mother. She walked with a cane and had wise, kind eyes. "You know," she said to James, "Elizabeth and Robert weren't always this way. When they were young, they struggled so much. Elizabeth worked 3 jobs to put Robert through business school." The next morning, Officer James Miller was back on duty, patrolling the quiet streets of Riverdale. The events of the wedding kept playing in his mind. He had seen something rare yesterday: a family finding their way back to each other after nearly breaking apart. His police radio crackled. "Officer Miller, please return to the station when convenient. Chief wants to see you." James wondered if he was in trouble for staying at the wedding. He had been off duty by then, but maybe someone had complained. He drove back to the small police station in the center of town. The police chief, a gray-haired man named Bill Thompson, was waiting in his office. "Miller, come in. Sit down." James sat, preparing for a lecture. "Chief, about yesterday at the Conway wedding." Chief Thompson held up his hand. "That's exactly what I want to talk about. Do you know who Robert Conway is?" James thought back to what he had learned. A businessman who worked his way up from nothing. The chief leaned forward. "Robert Conway is one of the richest men in this part of the state. His company employs half the town. And I'd got him on the phone this morning, asking specifically about you." James felt his stomach sink. Had Robert Conway decided to complain after all? "He wants to make a donation to the police department," the chief continued. "A big one. For new equipment, training, whatever we need. And he specifically mentioned you." James was stunned. "Me? Why?" "He said you taught him something important yesterday. Something about seeing people for who they really are, not who you want them to be." The chief looked curious. "What exactly happened at that wedding, Miller?" James thought about how to explain it. "A family learned to listen to each other, sir. That's all." Later that day, as James was finishing his shift, a delivery person arrived at the station with a large bouquet of wildflowers and a note. The flowers looked just like the ones from the wedding. The note read, "Officer Miller, these flowers may be simple, but they're real and true, just like the advice you gave us yesterday. Because of you, we didn't just attend our daughter's wedding. We truly saw it, and her, for the first time. With deepest gratitude, Elizabeth and Robert Conway. James placed the flowers on his desk, touched by the gesture. As he was about to leave, the station door opened again. This time, it was David and Melissa, still glowing with happiness. "We're on our way to the airport for our honeymoon," Melissa explained. "But we wanted to see you first." David handed James an envelope. "We wanted you to have this." Inside was a photograph taken at the wedding. It showed James standing with both families, everyone smiling. On the back was written, "To our unexpected guest of honor, thank you for helping our families become one. We're going to frame a copy for our new home," David said, "to remind us that sometimes help comes from unexpected places." Melissa hugged James. "My parents called us this morning. They invited us to dinner when we get back from our honeymoon. My mom even asked for David's aunt's cake recipe." James smiled. "That sounds like a good start." After they left, James sat at his desk looking at the photo. In his job, he often saw people at their worst moments. He dealt with arguments, fights, and people hurting each other. Rarely did he get to see the happy endings. As he drove home that evening, James passed by the old church. The cleanup from the wedding was complete, but he could see fresh dirt in the memorial garden, where new plants had been added. He thought about the Conways and the Wilsons, two very different families now joined together. He thought about how easy it would have been for that wedding to end in disaster, with broken relationships and bitter feelings. Sometimes, James reflected, the most important police work wasn't about enforcing laws. It was about helping people find their way back to each other. And sometimes the most valuable things weren't expensive flowers or fancy cakes. They were the simple moments when people saw each other clearly, with love and understanding. 6 months later, Officer James Miller sat in his patrol car outside the Riverdale Community Hospital. The new police cars had arrived last week, thanks to Robert Conway's generous donation. The entire department had been transformed with new equipment and training programs. James was there for the opening of a new free clinic. After Melissa and David returned from their honeymoon, they had shared their dream with their parents to open a place where anyone could get medical care, no matter how little money they had. To everyone's surprise, Robert and Elizabeth Conway had fully supported the idea. More than that, they had used their money and connections to make it happen faster than anyone thought possible. James walked into the building and was amazed by what he saw. The waiting room was bright and welcoming. Children played in a small corner with toys. The walls were decorated with local artwork. "Officer Miller." James turned to see David walking toward him, wearing scrubs with the clinic logo. They shook hands warmly. "I'm so glad you could come," David said. "Melissa is just finishing with a patient. She'll be out soon." Elizabeth Conway appeared, looking very different from the angry woman James had first met. Today she wore simple clothes and a warm smile. She was carrying a tray of cookies. "James, you're here," she said happily. "Try one of these. David's Aunt Patty taught me how to make them." James took a cookie, surprised that Elizabeth Conway was now baking. "These are delicious," he said after taking a bite. "Not bad for someone who never set foot in a kitchen until 6 months ago," Elizabeth laughed. "Turns out I enjoy baking. Who knew?" Robert Conway was talking with local business owners, encouraging them to support the clinic. When he saw James, he came over. "The man of the hour," Robert said, shaking James's hand. "Without you, none of this would exist." "I think you're giving me too much credit," James said. "This is all your family's doing." Robert shook his head. "No, this is what happens when people see each other clearly. You helped us do that." Melissa joined them, wearing a white doctor's coat. "The clinic is already fully booked for the next 2 weeks," she said proudly. People really needed this place. The mayor of Riverdale gave a short speech, cutting a ribbon to officially open the Conway-Wilson Free Clinic. Everyone clapped and cheered. After the ceremony, James found himself standing with both families in the garden outside the clinic. It was filled with the same wildflowers from the wedding. "We're continuing the tradition," Linda Wilson explained. Every important family event, we plant more flowers. The garden at the church has doubled in size, Thomas added. And now we have this one too. James looked at the two families standing together. 6 months ago, they had been divided by anger and misunderstanding. Now they worked together, united by love for their children and a shared mission to help others. So, what's next for you two? James asked Melissa and David. They exchanged a happy look before Melissa answered. Well, in about 7 months, you'll need to add another flower to the garden. It took James a moment to understand what she meant. You're having a baby. Everyone erupted in excitement. Both grandmothers-to-be cried happy tears. The grandfathers-to-be shook hands, then gave each other a slightly awkward hug. We just found out last week, David explained. You're the first outside the family to know. I'm honored, James said, truly touched. As the family celebrated the news, James thought about how much had changed because of one wedding day. The Conways had learned to value simplicity and caring over appearances. The two families had become one. And now a new life would join them, a child who would grow up surrounded by love and understanding. Later, as James drove home, he passed the old church where it had all started. The Conway-Wilson Memorial Garden was bursting with colorful flowers. He remembered the angry couple he had met there 6 months ago and how different they were now. In his 15 years as a police officer, James had learned that people could change, but rarely had he seen such a complete transformation. From anger to understanding, from control to acceptance, from focusing on appearances to seeing what truly mattered. Sometimes, James thought, the most important things in life are the simplest ones: love, understanding, and the courage to see people for who they really are.